So today I'm going to be walking through how to add ruffles to your sewing projects, particularly to your clothing sewing projects. I am going to be adding a ruffle to the bottom edge of some trousers in this video, but I also use this same technique for skirts and sleeves. I think that's everything, so let's get on with the tutorial. So this is everything that you're going to need for this tutorial. You will need some fabric to cut your ruffles out of. I'm going to be using matching fabric to my trousers, but you can use a different fabric if you want to. You will need a ruler, some fabric scissors or a rotary cutter, some fabric pens or tailor's chalk, some pins, and a tape measure. I'm going to be adding my ruffle to this bottom edge here, and the first thing that we need to do is to calculate the length that that ruffle needs to be. So I need to measure the size of this opening here. The easiest way to do that is to just measure along the front and multiply by 2. So that is about 18 inches, so multiplied by 2, that is 36. So this opening here is about 36 inches all the way round. So now that we know the size of this opening here, we can calculate the length that our ruffle needs to be. And our ruffle is going to be larger than this opening so that we can gather it later in the video. So I'm going to take my 36 and I'm going to multiply by 1.5, which gives me 54. So the length of my ruffle is going to be 54 inches. If when you watch this video you think that you would like your ruffle to be more gathered than mine is, you just pick a slightly larger number. I would recommend anything between 1.5 and 2. So for example, I could take my 36 and multiply by 1.7, which gives me a slightly longer length. But I'm going to stick with 1.5, which is the standard multiplier I use for ruffles, and I'm going to go with that 54 inches. In terms of your width, that is completely up to you. I'm going to go with a width of about 5 inches because I want quite a small ruffle, but make sure that you take into account that you will need to hem that ruffle at the end. So I'm going to be doing a length of 54 inches by 5 inches, and I'm going to go ahead and cut those pieces out. So these are the pieces that I've got for my ruffle. The reason I've got 2 pieces is that my fabric wasn't quite long enough to cut out 54 inches in one go, so I've done it in 2 pieces instead. So these are both 27 inches long and 5 inches wide. I'm going to take these 2 pieces and lay them one on top of the other and pin along these short edges. If you've only got one piece, you'll just need to fold that piece in half and pin along your short edges. The goal here is to make one continuous piece. So now that I've got those pins added, I'm just going to go in with a straight stitch and sew both of those edges in place. I'm also going to go in with an overlocker and finish off the raw edges, but you can also use a zigzag stitch. So that's how those seams are looking, and now I'm going to move on to add my gather lines. So the first thing that I'm going to do is to find the 1/2 and 1/4 points of this ruffle. This is optional, but I like to work in slightly smaller sections when I'm gathering, especially when I'm gathering quite large pieces. You definitely don't need to do this if you're working with smaller pieces of fabric like sleeves, for example, but I find it a lot easier when I'm working with quite large pieces of fabric. So my 1/2 points are going to be at these side seams here. I'm just going to place a pin at both sides. You don't need to add a pin here, obviously you know where that 1/2 point is because of the seam. It will just make it a bit easier for the video so that you can see what I'm doing. And to find those 1/4 points, I'm just going to take this piece and fold it with those 2 side seams, one on top of the other, and then these new folds at either end become your 1/4 point. So now that I've got those pins added, I can start to add the stitch lines that I'm going to use to gather the piece. So I'm going to work in these sections between the pins, and I'm going to add 2 stitch lines along the top of each section just with a straight stitch, and I want to start some new lines every time I reach those pins. And every time I start and end my stitch, I want to make sure that I leave quite nice long tails of thread because they're what we're going to use to gather the piece. So I'm going to show you exactly how I'm going to sew those gather lines on my machine. So the first thing I'm going to do is to just set my machine to the longest stitch length, which is a 4 on my machine. And then I'm going to start at one pin and sew round to the next pin. Just stopping when I get to that next pin and trimming off nice long tails. I'm going to go right back to where I started and sew another line right below that first one. And again, finishing when I get to that second pin and trimming off nice long tails. And then you can move on to the next section and do exactly the same thing. So starting with one stitch line at the very top. And stopping when you get to that next pin. And then going back and sewing a line right below the one that you just did. And then again, nice long tails. I'm going to do the other two sections off camera. I've just finished sewing those gather lines in place. You can see I've got 2 lines at the top of each section, but for each section I start those lines again. And you can see those nice long tails that we're going to use to gather the piece. So now I can go back and pin this to that bottom edge of the trousers. So before I pin that ruffle in place, I'm just going to find the same points for the bottom edge of these trousers as I found for that ruffle. So side seams are our half points, and then to find those quarter points, I'm just going to fold it in half with those side seams one on top of the other. So then I've got 1 quarter point here and one at the other side. Fold that back to how it was. And now I can start to pin that ruffle in place. So I'm going to take my ruffle, I've got my gather lines at the bottom, and place it over the top of those trousers. And you want the trousers to be the right way out for this and your ruffle to be inside out. And as you can see, the ruffle is much bigger than the trousers as it's supposed to be. I'm just going to start to pin some of those corresponding points together. So put the centre front here, pin the ruffle to the trousers and remove that spare pin, the side seam, and then the side seam on the other side, and finally the centre back. So now that all of those pieces are pinned in place, probably looks a little bit crazy at the moment, but just trust the process. So now you can start to gather each section. So all I'm going to do is find a couple of those threads and just start to pull on that fabric while you hold on to those threads. And you'll see that it will gradually start to gather the piece. And your goal here is to make the ruffle the same size as each section of those trousers. I like to do this quite roughly until I've got the ruffle the right size, and then I'll go in and spread the ruffle more evenly. So that's looking at about the right size. So I'm just going to tie off these threads on both sides. Just helps it to stay gathered as much as it is now. And now I can go in and more evenly distribute those gathers until I'm happy with it. And once it's looking a bit more even and you're happy with how it's looking, you can go in with some pins and pin this first section in place. And once that first section is all pinned in place, you can just go in and repeat those same steps for your remaining 3 sections. So this is how your ruffle will be looking once you have gathered each section and added those pins. You can see that the ruffle now fits perfectly to the size of the trousers. And now I can go in with my machine and sew that in place. So I'm just going to set my machine back down to a 2.5 length, which is the standard length I use. And I'm just going to start to sew around that top edge. Nice and straightforward. And then I'm just coming back round to where I started, so I'm going to join up that stitch line. Now I'm going to finish off this raw edge with my overlocker. If you don't have an overlocker, you can also use a zigzag stitch, but you will have to go in and trim off some of those tails while you're doing that. So this is how that seam is looking. Now you can fold that ruffle down, and the only thing you've got left to do is just to finish this bottom edge. I'm going to use a standard double hem, so I'm just going to fold that bottom edge towards the wrong side of the fabric twice, and then sew it in place with a straight stitch. And then once you've finished off that bottom edge, then your ruffle is finished.